My name is Wade or Ryan Mackey. I have the privilege of being able to use my Cherokee name in my community and at work. Most of the time, I'm responsible for different language programs. About 5 years ago, me and some of my friends, we got together and we started a program called Cherokee Language Master Apprentice. It used to be called Chilak Gomoni His Tani Wisask. However, over the last year, we have been incorporated into a brand new language department, which took on that Cherokee name for itself. So our Master Apprentice language program is now Chilak Gomoni His Undanilage, which means kind of like older siblings to people that are learning the language. And it's our job to ensure that we have people that can speak Cherokee well enough to teach Cherokee. For years and years, our immersion programs were focused on children because, you know, that's really where it's at. We got to make sure that our kids talk Cherokee. But what we learned is that if they don't have people their parents' age and younger to talk Cherokee with, they get really shy around the elders. And so their language learning stops when they leave our immersion schools. So we implemented adult immersion language. We decided to focus on creating teachers very first. People were going through our local university, Northeastern State University, to get a degree in the language. And they were becoming language teachers. They were taking language classes. They understood a lot about the language and they could talk a lot of the language, but they were still novice speakers when they left the program. They just didn't have enough contact time in Cherokee to be conversational. It takes a lot of time. We knew that Cherokee was different than English. And we were told by linguists, all languages are equally difficult. There is no such thing as one language that's harder than the rest. However, that's context specific. So if you already speak a language, it's easier to learn a language similar to the language you speak. So Spanish speakers would be better at learning Italian than they would be at learning Swahili. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. Turns out Cherokee is very different than English. So it's very difficult for English learners or English speakers to learn. And so it takes a lot more contact in the language to become conversational than we had originally realized. When this was apparent to us, we knew that we had to throw them in the language for years. So our Master Apprentice language program is 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for 2 years straight. And they leave able to speak Cherokee, but they still don't speak like elders. So we're developing all sorts of other ways to increase people's language proficiency. We like the word fluency, but fluency is sometimes hard to measure. Proficiency is a measurement of what you can do in the language, how you can function. So our program focuses on making very proficient language learners so they can in turn enter classroom environments and teach Cherokee using the language. We're eventually going to have to create people that can not just teach Cherokee language, but teach math, science, English, everything in Cherokee. And so we're working on that. The reason that I got so into language was because when I was young, I heard it, but I took it for granted. The speakers in my family have all passed away. I started to learn from other people's family. And the reason that the language became such an important focus for me was because I loved our culture. I grew up doing Cherokee things. I lived in the Cherokee Nation. My family is not one of the most prominent families. We don't have a lot of leadership in the communities, but you know, we're just everyday Cherokees doing Cherokee things. And I always thought there would be other young people that were more centered and more grounded in the language and culture than me. And so for me, it was just about learning what I could for myself. But as I got to know people in our community, it lit a fire in me and I began to feel a responsibility to not only learn about things, but to really understand them. And it became clear to me to understand who we are and what we do and why we do it. I would have to be able to ask questions in Cherokee and listen to what they had to tell me. And I was not ready for that. So the language became step one, learning about the culture for me. You can learn about the culture without the language, but the deepest, strongest ties to our culture are still communicated in the language of our ancestors. Our elders that speak the language, that think in the language, they're speaking and thinking in the language of our ancestors. And they're thinking and speaking the same thoughts that we have always spoken from the beginning of time. And I need to learn at the feet of my elders. So we're talking about festivals today, Cherokee holidays. At this point, you're all aware of how integrated Cherokees are into the Western world. We're American citizens. We are Cherokee citizens, dual citizenship. But for some of us, it's clear that the American system doesn't meet all of our Cherokee needs. For me in particular, I wanted to know, what did my ancestors do? So I asked my elders. We still have ceremonial grounds. People still go there and they meet for specific occasions, for special occasions. Things have changed though. The original system that our ancestors probably followed is still on paper, and there are remnants of it at our ceremonial grounds, but they've been adapted to the modern world. So we're going to look at not just how our ancestors did things, but how people are still practicing these things today. There are a lot of culturally sensitive things that I've learned in confidence that I may not be able to go into. However, the things that are written down are open to anybody that wants to research them. What's interesting is that the people in our communities that carry the culture, that keep the culture alive, they don't read books about Cherokee culture. They don't need to, they live it. They don't need to read about what explorers saw or experienced, because they experience the culture every day. However, there are some interesting things that I found. I'm a dork, I'm a nerd. So I read a lot and it's informed my understanding. But as I was reading, I realized that these people that were writing about Cherokees, they were not writing for us. This stuff was not written for us. We were not the audience of their writings. It was the rest of the world. And a lot of times they didn't even believe what we had to say. They would write down what they observed, they would interpret it, and they would tell people what they thought it meant. So there was something really lacking in a lot of the historical accounts. By speaking to elders that a lot of them have passed on. Some of my best friends, they're gone now. The thing is, when you choose to engage in the culture, you make friends with people your age, but you spend a lot of time with the old folks. And so most of my friends have already had their funerals, but they were able to give me some insight in why we did the things that we did, what some of these things that were written about were really doing for our people. So we're going to look at the historical record. I'm not going to go into all the ethnographic literature. You can research that if you're an academic. However, I'll try to talk about those main points, and I'll try to situate it in a context that meets the modern day Cherokee perspective on some of these things. So first off, I have to take everybody back to early contact. As most of you know, our ancestors, they were not here on the Cherokee Reservation in what is now considered northeastern Oklahoma. They were originally on the East Coast, not right by the water, but in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, the Smoky Mountains. They say that we held more than 81 million acres. We had parts of 8 current day states. There's still a large group of Cherokees in North Carolina, but we also had parts of South Carolina, a little bit of Virginia, a little bitty bit of West Virginia, some of Tennessee. Kentucky was our hunting territory, and eventually we moved into northern Georgia and northern Alabama. As Europeans arrived on the continent and America grew as a country, European Americans expanded. And through treaty and other methods, our land base was gradually but radically reduced until the culmination of those events was the removal, the Trail of Tears in 1838. And at that point, there was a faction of Cherokees that went into treaty with the United States, the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, what many considered to be a fraudulent treaty. And they exchanged our Aboriginal homeland, what was left of our holding in the East, for fee simple land here in Indian Territory. Now, fee simple is considered the highest level of real estate that a person or a group of people can maintain. It's basically private property. So the Cherokee Nation reestablished itself here, and the land was held in common as private property, with the promise that it always would be. Of course, that changed. It began to be eroded with the Treaty of 1866 after the Civil War. Cherokees fought on both sides of that battle, on those battles. But we were held accountable for the faction of us that signed with the Confederacy. And so we lost control of some of our land to the railroads because of that. Other tribes came in and they bought up rights to not only Cherokee land, but Cherokee citizenship. And that included freedmen. So by the Treaty of 1866, we had non-Cherokees living with us. Some of them integrated into our communities. Some of them maintain their own identities. We still have the Delaware, the Shawnee. We even have people that speak Creek. At the time of Oklahoma statehood, when our lands were broken up into small pieces and passed back to our citizens as private property once again, these other tribes that were living amongst us were treated as tribal citizens. So even if you were completely Creek, if you were living with Cherokees, you became a Cherokee citizen. If you were 100% Creek, you were magically 100% Cherokee. For those tribes that had treaty rights because of the 1866 treaty, some of them have maintained their own tribal identities. However, a lot of them still engage in Cherokee culture, Cherokee lifeways, and Cherokee politics. So this is important. Our land base was broken into pieces because the tribe was supposed to be dissolved. It was supposed to be destroyed. And for the most part, it stopped functioning. The first thing they did is they took away our courts, which meant that we couldn't have free elections. Our chiefs were appointed by the President of the United States, and the tribe as a government entity ceased to function in any form of real governing capacity, but it existed on paper. There was something called the Five Civilized Tribes Act that allowed for us to continue in some capacity. And in 1972, there was a court case, Harjo versus Klept, where the Creek Nation successfully argued that they existed. They came back, they had free elections, and we followed suit. Recently, on the, there have been a lot of political disputes, but the Creeks, they had another issue. There was an individual that murdered another Creek citizen. One Creek citizen killed another on Creek land. And this person was set to death row according to Oklahoma criminal law. However, their lawyers successfully argued that Oklahoma law didn't apply because it was on Creek land. Well, they weren't arguing that it was on land owned by the Creek Nation and operated by the Creek Nation. They argued that this was their tribal land. This was their reservation land. Now, they, like us, had land in fee simple. However, when the government handed the land back to our citizens during the time of allotment, at the time of Oklahoma, they first confiscated it from the tribe. The federal government took the land away from the tribe, held it in reserve for sometimes just a moment, and then portioned that out back to the tribal citizens. That process was arguably reserving the land. I'd always argued that we didn't have a reservation here. In fact, we were on Indian land. It was Cherokee Nation land for us. For them, it was Creek Nation land. But this McGirt case that recently came about says that because at one point it was reservation, that reservation was never abolished. And last week, that was applied to us. So Cherokee Nation is a reservation. There are local governments, there are county governments, there are state governments that all interact with this reservation land. However, we can argue, and we are, that it is Cherokee Nation land. This all means that for over a century, our land has been in dispute. Our ceremonial grounds, our traditional communities, where the heart of our culture and language has survived and in some cases thrived, that was all under duress. So a lot of these things were put away. People would talk about them, but they didn't always do it. Some of the things that were done are no longer done. But these things still have relevance to us, especially when we look to the future and we try to see where we're going and why we're going there. It's sometimes good to look to the past, to see what our ancestors valued, to help us determine what we should be doing. That's what we've always done. We think of the future. We think of the future generations, 7 into the future, but also 7 into the past. So these festivals, I guess is a good word for it, or holidays, that's where we came from. And hopefully you will find some value in what we have to discuss today. I'll tell you first off, our ancestors lived in these villages. Every one of our villages had a ceremonial center. To be a real village, it wasn't just a settlement. It meant that you had all 7 families there. We only had 7 families back then. We call them clans now, but they were really 7 families. And we got our family from our mom. So if your mom was Cherokee, you were Cherokee. If your dad was from another tribe and he wanted to be in your life, he had to come live with your mom and do Cherokee things. That's just how it was. He had to learn to speak Cherokee. We were odd. Our language is different than all of our neighbors. Most of the neighbors around us, the other tribes, they spoke different dialects of a Muskogean language family. Really, they have different languages. We were the odd ones out. We're the only Southern Iroquoian language. If nobody speaks Cherokee, we don't have anywhere else to go to learn about our language. The closest living relative to Cherokee language is the Mohawk language, and they say that we diverged from them between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago. That's what the linguists say. I don't know, I wasn't there. But I've hung out with Mohawks, and I don't understand what they're saying. Sometimes they say words that sound familiar, and I ask them what they mean, and they don't mean the same thing. However, our culture was much more similar to our neighbors. Even though our language was different, our cultural practices were very similar to like the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole. Our other neighbors in the Southeast that lived around us, like the Shawnee, we all influenced each other. We all interacted. We even had other tribes living amongst us. Within the Cherokee Nation, we had villages of Shawnees and Creeks. We had villages of Nachi Indians. We had villages of Yuchi Indians. And they existed. And if we weren't fighting them one year, we were friends with them the next. And each village was autonomous. So one Cherokee town could be fighting with the Creeks and their neighboring town would be friends with them. Each town had their own leadership and they got to make decisions for themselves. What they were not supposed to do was fight other Cherokee towns. So every town had a fire in the center. To have a fire, you had to have all 7 clans, all 7 families there. That meant you could go to another Cherokee town and you would have family there too, because there would be people from your family, your clan there. Whether they knew you or not, they would take you in and treat you just as a brother or a sister would. You would have all the same rights and responsibilities as somebody born there. Immediate family. And we did not go to war with family. So we didn't go to war with other Cherokee towns. That was unconscionable. We didn't always agree, so we played stickball. One town would side up against another town, and instead of people trying to kill each other, they would play a game. It's not really a game. It was a ceremonial replacement for warfare, because whatever they might have fought over was settled on the ball field. Sometimes people got hurt. Well, they always got hurt. Sometimes people got killed though. But the object was to score points, not to kill your opponent. And the winner of the ball game was the winner of the conflict. And that's how we settled things, not just with other Cherokee towns, but with other tribes. And that's important. The ball game was a part of our governing structure. It was a conflict resolution system. Just like the United States uses war to handle their political conflicts, we use stickball to handle ours. It was preferable to war. We did go to war. If somebody from another tribe came and killed 5 or 6 people from my family would raise a war party, and we would go to that tribe and we would take an equal number of lives. We kept the balance. They did the same to us. What was better than actually killing your enemy was taking a captive. If you could replace the people in your family lost with people from another tribe and present those captives to the women in your family and say, these people represent my brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles, your family that was lost. You do with them what you will. Sometimes they were adopted and raised as Cherokees. They became Cherokee. They were Cherokee. Sometimes they were put to death. And the women themselves often were the ones that did that. They owned them. What's interesting is sometimes we would take these captives, and it's compared to slavery, but it was a different system. We did own people. We still own people. If you have a clan, you don't belong to just yourself. You belong to your entire family. When I say Digi Yahweh, that means my people. Yahweh, Yao is person. Ziyao, I'm a person. Hiyao, you're a person. Ayao, they're a person. Aniyao, they are people. So when I say Digiyao, I'm saying those are my people, but I'm also saying I belong to them. I belong to them. They belong to me. So if another person from my own village, or even another Cherokee village, say, you know, everybody has crazy cousins. Say somebody's crazy cousin just goes nuts and kills somebody from my family will go to that family. Well, we're talking historically, would have gone to that family and demanded that person's life. And if that person ran away, we would take their brother or their uncle, their next of kin, because that family was held responsible for what their family member did. So you had to really, really sit on your family. Because if you had a crazy cousin and you went and killed 5 people from another family, there were 5 of you that had to pay for it. So our clan system was also a part of our civil government. It was a part of our criminal government. Our clan system was the foundation of our government. They would meet in council regularly to come to consensus, to determine things for each community. And each community, like I said, was autonomous. And each community dealt with the world how they saw fit. And before European contact, the world was pretty regular. There were a lot of things in common between communities, but after contact, things started to shift, and it depended on where you were, how those things shifted. So even before removal, we began to lose some of our ceremonies and traditions because our communities would adapt and change to meet the needs of the new world that they found themselves in, the post-contact world. Not just trade and disease and warfare, but new ideas were coming to our people. And so our culture began to change very early on. There have always been people that have held on to the foundation of what they thought it meant to be Cherokee. And there were some of those communities that physically removed themselves before the Trail of Tears, came to eastern Tennessee, to western Arkansas, or eastern Arkansas, then western Arkansas, over several generations, 2 or 3 generations. They say it started as early as the 1720s. That's what oral tradition tells us. Maybe even earlier than that. But we have it documented as early as the 1790s that there were Cherokee communities moving west. Some of these communities established themselves in western Arkansas, and they brought their ceremonial fires with them. When they established themselves in Indian Territory and made way, a home for the people to come on the removal, they brought the fires here with them. You can't do all the ceremonies and jump through all the hoops to successfully move a fire on the Trail of Tears. But these fires came ahead and they waited for us. And we established our ceremonial communities. Our ancestors lived around their fires, but the new communities, they situated the fires oftentimes off in the woods, and people would camp there for ceremonial events, festivals, and then they would go back to the regular communities. Not all Cherokees participated. Only a fraction of Cherokees reestablished these ceremonial grounds for their communities. Some of these things were done away with before the removal, so when they were removed here, they didn't pick it up. But some of them, they saw the value in it. And those early ceremonial leaders that were old settlers already living here in Indian Territory, they helped reestablish the ceremonial system. And all of these communities, if they wanted it, they could take a piece of that fire and reestablish their ceremonial systems. But the systems had changed. What we used to do is we always followed the planting cycle. Our subsistence was primary focus for all of our festivals. Not just the farming cycle, but when we hunted, when we gathered, when we played stickball, when we went to war. All of these things were tied to how we structured our festivals. However, the guiding factor was, when do you plant the corn? Corn was absolutely necessary. It was our staple crop. We grew beans and sunflowers and pumpkins and even some varieties of squash. But let me go on a real quick tangent here. Everybody talks about the three sisters, and it's something that's a part of us now. But when I talk to the Cherokee speakers about it, they say we don't have a word for that. So I talked to some of our Haudenosaunee friends, Longhouse people, known as the Iroquois, Mohawks being among them, our closest linguistic relatives. And I asked them, what is this three sisters thing? And they believed in this deity that was actually three women, spiritual beings that represented corn, beans, and squash. And they grew those things together in their gardens, and it was primary in a lot of their festivities and religious observances. We didn't have that. We had a similar growing pattern, but we didn't have that being in our system. Our stories don't talk about this triple aspect of produce. We have Corn Mother, we have Selu, and in the old stories, they say that she produced both corn and beans. But we did have some squash. We grew it, but more than that, we had pumpkins. We had sunflowers. We had other crops like tobacco that were used for ceremonial purposes. Tobacco is native to the United States. The variety that we use most of the time now, we call it commercial tobacco. It's Nicotiana tabacco. It is originally from Central and South America, and it was exported to the southeastern United States and used as a cash crop. It's still what we smoke. Our ancestors had a different variety, a different species, Nicotiana rustica. We call it Joel la Guyenne. It means ancient tobacco, sometimes called mountain tobacco or wild tobacco. It can grow in the wild, but it doesn't do very well. It really needs to be domestic. We have to take care of it. It's a different looking plant. It has different leaves, and they say that it has about 5 times the nicotine of regular tobacco. And ceremonially, we still grow it. We still have it in our seed bank, and our heirloom garden provides that for citizens that want to contact them. They'll mail you some seeds, but it's not an easy smoke, I'll tell you that. But tobacco was still one of our primary important things that we grew in our garden. It was family. These things were family to us. Just as the corn was our mother, these other things were family as well. And planting these things was a huge part of our ceremonial cycle. So our new year was in the fall. And I guess at this point, we may as well put up this PDF. And I'll talk for about 15 minutes about these festivals and put them in some modern day context. And then I want to open it up to questions. So if you get a chance, screen share the PDF. And it's called 6 Main Cherokee Festivals or Religious Observances. I have a doc of it. I don't know if I can share it. Joseph, I see what you're saying on here, and I will address this here soon. But I'm going to go ahead and try to talk a little bit about these festivals. And you guys are also welcome to type in questions, or in a little bit I'll mute myself, and you can speak up if you like. But let me see, view. Could somebody, oh, I can screen share this, by golly. No, I need to ask for permission.
I'll give you permission right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Awesome. All right. So thank goodness my face will go away. And pardon me. And I can screen share this document for everybody. I'm young, but I'm not a digital native. So this is a little bit challenging at times. So this is not the prettiest document, but we put it together to talk about some important religious observations. You could argue that what our ancestors did was or was not religion. It just really depends on how you look at things. The early explorers and settler colonialists that interacted with us said we didn't have laws, we didn't have religion. It's just, it didn't fit their definition. So from one perspective, from our perspective, we could call it religion, but we could just as easily throw away that label and call it something different. There were 6 main Cherokee festivals. That's true. Sometimes there's a 7th that's documented, but we're trying to, stick to the stuff that we know the best about. We still call our chiefs Uganwiyu. So our current principal chief, Chief Hoskin, is our Uganwiyu from a political perspective, but each community also had their own Uganwiyu. Now, when you spell it out, it's Uganwiyu-he, but a lot of times with Cherokee nouns, the final vowel is not voiced. Uganwiyu is what most people say. And in some of the documentation, you'll just see it spelled Ugu or Uku, but nobody uses that, so I'm not sure about it. 7 principal counselors, 1 from each clan. Dini Lawik, and it was slightly different from town to town, but these things were absolute. They happened. They had to be there to carry out these ceremonies. Dini Lawik, that's our council. We could call the Cherokee Nation Council that as well. But originally it was specific to our communities. Each one of these villages that had the fire had these 7 clans, and each one had a representative. There was also basically 2 types of government. There was the Ganwiyu and his Dini Lawig, but they were considered peace leaders. They had other people a lot of times in these towns that performed other services that were officers of the community, leaders that served the people. People that were like the vice chief or deputy chief, we called them the right-hand man. We had a speaker, we had messengers, we had elder beloved women, which are sometimes called clan mothers. We had elder beloved men, which are sometimes called medicine people. Each community got to figure out exactly how this worked. But one thing that was certain is they all had Ganwiyu and they all had Dini Lawig. That was just a part of it. There was also another branch of government because these people were there to maintain order and civility and consistency. They ran things most of the time, or at least they served people most of the time. However, in times of war, this system was not the best system to handle emergencies. You know how it is with red tape. When things get caught up in committee, things don't always go as quickly as you like them to. So there was a reflection of this that basically had the same system. However, there was a war version, a red branch of government. If this was the peace branch of government, the white system, there was also a red branch, a war government. They had their own war chief, they had their own war counselors, they had these medicine people that would go into battle and act as medics for the people on the field. The regular government, what you could call the white government or peace government, was in control most of the time. And the way they determined which side was going to lead things, the white side or the red side, was through the admonition of the elder women. When the women got together and said, we need to do something to set things right, then the war side took over. Red in Cherokee is Giege. Giege means the color of blood. Geeg is blood. So Giage, the red branch, is the branch that represents this blood, not just the blood of our enemies that is spilled, but the blood of our own family that was taken. They said the blood cried out, and it needed justice. Red for us is not just blood, but it represents true purpose. It represents righteousness. We believed it was wrong to kill people. We believed warfare was not good. Although some of the folks that wrote about us said it was our favorite pastime, just like baseball is for most Americans. Apparently, war was something that people may have enjoyed. It wasn't the same kind of war that we think about today. It was small scale skirmishes, hand-to-hand combat. In fact, we valued hand-to-hand combat over shooting people with bows and arrows and later guns. We had to switch to guns, but it was much more honorable to face your opponent in battle. And if you could take them captive, so much the better. But as long as we knew that warfare was wrong, we knew how valuable peace was. One of the things that we considered to be worse than warfare was to stand by and watch innocents be killed. So we had a red branch to defend the peace. That's what it was for, was to maintain that balance. And it plays into our calendar. The first new moon of spring was held in March, modern day March. A lot of modern day Cherokee speakers, they don't know the months of the year in Cherokee, which is really interesting because we teach that to our kids, one of the first things, just like we do in preschool and mainstream America. We teach our young kids at the immersion school the Cherokee words for the months. But our elders a lot of times don't care because we've kind of lost contact with the original calendar. The new moon of spring was really important because it set up the farming calendar. It set up when we planted. And like I said previously, the crops were of primary importance to our lives. We got about 80% of our diet from the things that we grew in our gardens. The other 20% was from what we hunted and gathered from the woods. So the first festival was when this new moon happened. And it was actually kind of hard to determine what on earth this means. I had to talk to a lot of different elders because new moon in mainstream society is the dark of the moon when there's no moon in the sky. There are 29 and a half days between each new moon from one month to the next. And there are also 29 and a half days between each full moon from one month to the next. So is the full moon the new moon or is it the dark of the moon? Turns out neither one were. It's when this crescent first appeared in the west. So about 2 days after the dark of the moon, you can see this crescent in the west right before it sets. And that new moon, that crescent moon, signaled the beginning of the month for us. And there was always fasting done. People still do this. They'll fast 4 days. And then they see that crescent. There are songs, there are words that we say, there are things that we do to still bless our families. A lot of these things are no longer done by the entire community. However, individual families will do remnants of all of these things. What was important is that you couldn't draw blood. If you were bleeding, you couldn't enter ceremony. If you had drawn blood, you couldn't enter ceremony. So they would send these hunters out ahead of time to prepare whatever game that they needed in time so they themselves could participate in the festivities. So this new moon of spring, it was the first new moon that appeared after the spring equinox. Now our ancestors were smart. They knew when the equinoxes were, when the days and the nights were equal in both the spring and the fall, but it was even easier to determine when the solstices were. Summer solstice, longest day of the year, and winter solstice, shortest day of the year. So the first new moon after the spring equinox was when we did this first new moon of spring. Sometimes that actually happens in April. But again, we weren't following the Gregorian calendar. Our calendar fit the seasons, it fit the moons. These ceremonial dances that they talk about are still done. Today, if you go to one of our stomp grounds or ceremonial grounds, you'll see people lead stomp dance songs, and that was a part of it. But there are lots of other songs and dances that were done in historical times, and people still know some of these songs, still do some of these dances, but the context has changed. So most of the time, people are going to lead what we call stomp dance songs today. That's what you're going to see most of the time. But our ancestors had a wider variety of songs, and they did them at specific times of the year. So as this calendar became less and less influential in our ceremonies, the songs and dances associated also have become less common. These 7 counselors, their all-night dance rebuilt the fire. So this fire lived always. We used to have the fire on top of a mound. There was a huge mound in our larger towns, and they would build the council house on top of it. And then when the chief passed away, they would burn down the council house. They would bury the leader's body next to the fire. They would cover it with river clay. They would build a new council house, and it would start all over. This fire lived inside of the council house. They say they put this hollow tree in the ground and went way down deep inside of the mound, so that fire lived always. Well, what they would do is they would take the top of the fire and they would let it go out. And then they would rekindle a fresh fire on top of that hearth. And the fire on top of the hearth would grow down just as the fire underneath the mound would grow up, and they would meet in the middle and the fire would be renewed. There was this thing called scratching that people did. People sometimes still do it. It's not as common as it used to be. I was told that in the 80s, they came among our traditional communities and told us to stop doing it because of the spread of AIDS. However, some people have maintained a sanitary practice and are able to keep people safe while they scratch, and they've done it in silence. However, there is a threat of sanction. The elders in our communities were told that this was dangerous, and if they continued to do so, they could be charged with practicing medicine without a license. However, it still happens. The idea is that just like when you take a shot, a hypodermic needle exposes your innards to whatever the medicine is that you're being given. So by scratching somebody, you're opening yourself up to being washed with medicine. Also by scratching, they say that this blood comes out, and it's part of the renewal process. Obviously, bleeding people weren't going to be dancing. But after the dance, this is what they did, especially at the green corn ceremony. Now, all the tribes in the Southeast talk about this green corn ceremony, but ours is actually called Selu Chunigisti. I've also heard it called DJ Selu Chunigisti, which is more like they're eating long and rigid things. So, well, you know, the idea is that it's fresh corn, it's new corn. So in Cherokee, the word green, Idze used, means like new. So fresh corn was literally green corn. And it was when the corn was first fit to eat, when it was ripe on its stalks, roasting year's time. And we didn't eat it all then, but we would gather it, and we would fast, and we would dance all night, and we would eat together. And this was tied to one of our old stories about how the Thunder Boys killed their mom, Selu, and they were supposed to drag her body around in a circle and stay up all night, and they weren't able to do it. And so we don't have corn all the time. It just grows, you know, certain times of the year. So we dance all night. We remember those times, and we still give thanks for that corn. Not every Cherokee ceremonial ground recognizes or participates in green corn. But that's okay, because they still celebrate the corn at every dance. They celebrate everything at every dance. All of our songs are Thanksgiving songs. All of our dances are Thanksgiving dances. And this green corn ceremony was just a formal way to specifically give thanks for the corn. And there were specific dances that were done at this time. It was also really important because this was the time when we started preparing for stickball. There was always fasting going on. Our leaders were expected to fast for 7 days. Every day people fasted sometimes 4 or just 1 day, depending on their needs. But what they fasted from, most importantly, was new corn. So they could only eat last year's corn up until this ceremony. So they planted the corn earlier this spring. It's growing, it's ready, it's out there in the fields, but they didn't touch it until everybody went through this purification celebration. They would drink a specific medicine. They would go through scratching ceremonies, dance all night, go to water for purification. And then as a community, they would break fast from corn together. But most of the corn was kept in the fields or harvested when it was fully hardened. As I scroll down here, you can see that there's more information about green corn. Talking about going to water. You can go to water anytime. They say the best time to go is right before the sun comes up. Even before the birds start singing, you're supposed to beat the birds. And by going to water, it renews your body. It renews your spirit. Our ancestors taught that our bodies and spirits were connected. So before anything happened to us in the physical world, there was a spiritual side. So going to water took care of both of those things. You can see why Cherokees easily became Baptists. Right after the green corn ceremony, well, actually not right after, but about a month and a half after, they had the ripe corn ceremony. And now these English names are silly. You can call it mature green corn, ripe corn, whatever you want to call it. Other tribes in the Southeast, they didn't have two of these. They would just have one. But we had two. One for when the corn was first fit to eat, and one for when it was hard or ripe on the corn stalks. And that was when we would harvest all of it, and we would set it aside to use throughout the rest of the year. And that was really the first kind of Thanksgiving for us. It was a big harvest time for us. And it happened at the late summer or early fall. And modern day at the ceremonial grounds, we have Oniga Duwak ceremonial grounds, Katuas, not hot Katuas, original Katua Society. All of our grounds used to be under one system, but now they're broken up into different groups, different societies. But a couple of them came from one philosophy, one way of thinking. And this philosophy was led by a man named Redbird Smith, Jagason. And he lived around the time of Oklahoma statehood. And he organized all these ceremonial grounds, and he was selected as principal chief of this society. And after he passed away, everything kind of fell apart. But these grounds still exist. And some of them celebrate his birthday on July 19th, which is about the time of our old green corn ceremony. A lot of them also celebrate, I don't know what you could call it. They call it national holiday now, but they used to call it convention. All the grounds would come together and meet late summer, early fall. And it was the same time of year that we have our national holiday now. And that was our ripe corn ceremony. It's no longer associated with the corn crop like it used to be. But at one time, no self-respecting Cherokee would go without a corn plot. Our lifestyles have changed. People don't grow corn like they used to, but they still have remnants of these systems. For the most part, it was very similar to the green corn ceremony, but it was a 4-day process because we did day dances. They danced in the daytime. They did specific dances throughout the day. They rebuilt their arbors. They rebuilt their houses. Everything was covered with fresh green things. And that's how they celebrated. It was a challenge to go through all the work to do that. They had to fast. They had to pray. There was a process to go through. But then they would dance 4 days in the sun. They would sing these songs. They would do these dances, and then they would dance late into the night, sometimes all night long. And there was, again, a different kind of medicine that they would drink and they would wash off with. And this not only helped them prepare spiritually for the changing of the seasons, but also physically. There were always these feasts. There were always these dances. After Oklahoma statehood, it became illegal for Indians to gather. It became illegal for us to maintain these ceremonies. So they went underground. People still did them. They didn't dance in the daytime anymore. They just danced at night. Because of that, people started calling our ceremonial people Anisanoi, nighthawks, because they danced at night. And at first, people didn't like that name. It was kind of like an insult. Not really an insult, but it wasn't a name that our ceremonial people chose for themselves. It was a name that we were labeled with. But as time went on, people took that name and they wear it with pride. So some people are proud to be Nighthawks. So there are three different groups of Oniga Duwak, three different groups of Katua. There are the ceremonial people that maintain these ceremonies. There are the eastern band of Cherokees that speak a dialect of Cherokee called Gadua dialect. They translate that as middle, but it doesn't mean middle. There's a mound back east outside of Bryson City, North Carolina. And this mound, they say, is our mother town. The original fire, they say, lives inside of that mound to this day. And in the 90s, Joyce Duggan, the Eastern Band chief, principal chief, bought that land, and it's back in Cherokee hands. The Eastern Band hold it for all of us, and it's our sacred site, the place of our first fire, our mother town, and they call it Gadua. And the dialect that they speak on Kuala Boundary is the Gadua dialect. And so sometimes they call themselves Oniga Duwagi, just like the ceremonial people here in the Cherokee Nation Reservation do. But there's a third group, they're the political Katuas. They're also Oniga Duwag. And you have to be a quarter or more Cherokee on the Dawes rolls to be accepted. They have their own rolls, and they prefer exclusive membership. So they don't want people to be members of both Cherokee Nation and the United Katua Band. Their official name is the United Katua Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. And we're always fighting with them over land. It seems that land is the problem. Who controls the land, right? So they don't want Katua citizens to be Cherokee citizens. Cherokee Nation likes it when Katuas enroll with Cherokee Nation because, I mean, face it, we're the biggest group and we just want to absorb them. But they have their own federal recognition. They were recognized in 1951 by an act of Congress. So they're legit. They're their own tribe here in Tahlequah. I'm not going to focus on them, but there are three different groups of Cherokees that use this name, Oniga Duwak, and they say that that is our original name. The Great New Moon Festival, Nanda Dewa. That was really the first new moon after the fall equinox. It celebrated the season of autumn. Just like spring was the natural new year when things started to grow, things turned green, this is our spiritual new year. This is when the new year really began. It spiritually began 6 months ahead of time, before the physical new moon ever started, and people had to come together and come to consensus, talk about the year before, talk about the year ahead, and become synchronized. They went through different purification ceremonies. A lot of these ceremonies are similar. They did some specific things at each one of these festivals. However, the format was generally the same: fasting, dancing, going to water, playing ball. At this point, people were wrapping up any sort of stickball games that they were playing. This is the old stickball game, not the modern version we play men against women. That's there to strengthen our community. The old version was there to settle disputes between communities, and it was supposed to be wrapping up about this time. And anything that was still needing to be harvested was harvested. It was another huge Thanksgiving festival. But 2 weeks later, we had our last Thanksgiving festival, and really the second festival of the year, the second festival of the new year. And in Cherokee, they call Hona, and that really means to go get wood. It's from the verb to get wood. So I think it's a code. I'll be honest with you. I think it's a code, because it was when they would go and gather wood, because we didn't have chainsaws. We didn't used to have metal axes. So we had to get dead trees, burn them over, break them up into pieces, and bring them back and use them throughout the year. And we would stockpile our wood at this time. And we made peace. If we had been fussing with another community, playing ball, if we'd gone to war against another tribe, we would invite them to us. We would feast, we would dance with them, we would exchange gifts, and we would have a big old house cleaning party. Everything would be renewed, everything would be cleaned, the fire would be renewed again, and there were fasting and there was a special medicine taken. They say that when you go to water at this time of year, when the leaves are on the water, that's the strongest time of the year to go to water, because the rivers themselves have already provided the medicine. The Winter Festival is something that people, for the most part, don't do in any real form anymore. The previous one was sometimes called the physic dance or the medicine dance. And during times of hardship, warfare, and especially famine and disease, they would actually hold that physic dance or that medicine dance in a community just to help the people recover. So it wasn't exactly tied to that time of year, but it was done at different times of the year when it was needed. At least after European contact, these things changed, and some communities stopped it altogether. But there have always been families that have maintained that, and they still say that fall, when the leaves are on the water, is the best time. The Winter Festival was right after the winter solstice. That was when we did our booger dances, when people would come out and the masks, and they would show people how not to act. These people that were dressed up as these boogers, they were showing exactly what not to do. They did all the wrong things, and everybody paid attention, and they laughed at them. And there was a ceremonial process where they brought this chaos into their community. They entertained it, they satiated it, they bound it up, and they sent it home. And that was healing for us. There were also lots of different war dances done at this time, bird dances. So it was an important occasion. And there are certain songs you can only do in the winter. There are certain songs you can only do in each season. Some of that stuff is being lost, but I found at least 50 different songs and dances that our ancestors used to do. And we can still do about 40 of them. We still have them. It's just people don't do them like they used to. Now, I kind of went a little over. I apologize for that. I talked too much. But there are some questions that showed up, and I want to address those questions. You, Tanya Waduli, stop share. Okay. Many early settlers did not settle in Indian Territory, but remained in Arkansas and Missouri. Sacred Fire was kept in southeast Missouri, then Arkansas, then allowed to die. It was then resurrected in the early 1990s and currently resides in Butler, Missouri. Can you comment on this, please? Could you also comment on the new fire ceremony? This is a political question. So I know it's cultural in orientation. However, it has direct association with over 200 different groups of people that claim to be Cherokee tribes. And some of them might have legitimacy. Some of them certainly don't. I can't talk about this one specifically, but I can tell you this. There was a time when Redbird went up to White River, Missouri. And when White River, it was not considered an Indian community. In fact, the state said that there were no Indians there. And they were trying to become federally recognized, or at least a part of the Cherokee Nation. And Redbird went up there to talk to them about it. And what they decided was that they may keep what they do to themselves, but they didn't want to be kicked out of Missouri. They didn't want to come here. So they were left to their own accord. So at some point, there were Cherokees here in Oklahoma that recognized them and asked them to come home and be here. So there may be remnants of some of this stuff up there. I know that they don't engage with the main body of our Cherokee ceremonialists here in northeastern Oklahoma. But that's true. For generations, the fire was not in Indian territory. It didn't actually come to Indian territory until after 1818, when things were settled via treaty to prepare for the removal. The new fire ceremony, basically these fires were alive. They live in the mounds. We still have mounds in the center of our ceremonial grounds, and the fires are still alive in the center of them. And they don't die, but the fire goes out on the top. And so every weekend when we go out to play ball, we strike a new fire. Every dance, we strike a new fire. And our ancestors used to do that twice a year to renew the fire, to keep it clean, but it was always alive. There's some more questions and answers. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I can certainly look at these questions. There's an issue about Cherokee being spoken. It's hard with online classes. Weekly practice sessions are great. You can direct teach whatever you know. The thing is, you may not learn it exactly how it's said, but you can always correct yourselves later. What's important is that you use it. Use it wrong until you use it right. But always keep in mind that your goal is to use it right. If everybody waited until they spoke Cherokee perfectly to speak Cherokee, nobody would speak Cherokee. So speak it, use it, teach it, do whatever you can, and in time it'll get stronger. There's a recording of a fluent speaker to aid those that are learning. I would like to listen to that. Hear more about the Cherokee ways of fasting. What precautions were traditionally taken? We drank water. And we did not work. That was what we did. There was medicine we drank. It didn't have a lot of calories in it. It wasn't like it was bean medicine or anything like that, bean stew. But, it was roots and leaves and stems and such, bark. So there was probably some food value in that. We still fast. We still do that. And the thing is, if you're not physically able to do it, you're not required to do it. Nobody's forced to do anything. But if you want to be a leader, then the idea is you challenge yourself. You step up and you take responsibility for yourself and for your people. And those people that fast don't just fast for themselves, but they fast for others. And the idea is that by putting your will over your needs, by putting your intention over your hunger and choosing to fast, you're strengthening your spirit. And when everybody's fasting together, their spirits combined. That's the idea. So the precaution is that you didn't do anything while you were fasting except pray. You didn't work. You focused on the spiritual issue at hand. You asked a question, you fasted, and the answer came to you. That was its purpose. There were times when we had to work. And if somebody has to work, then people were allowed to have a small meal. If it didn't have meat, if it didn't have salt, they would have it was about the size of their palm of their hand. Every evening after the sun set, before it became completely dark, people were allowed to use that as medicine, and they would still be considered fasting. Not everybody agrees with that. We know it happened. We know it still happens, but some people are like, no, that's not a real fast, and you should just drink water or medicine. So you get divergent perspectives within every community, and between communities, you will find a lot of differences. Does anybody want to chime in? Yeah, Wadona God, thank you guys for sitting in on this. This was fun for me. I like to talk about this. I talk about language a lot, but I don't always get to talk about culture. People can also, unmute if you want to.
I think I have to unmute them.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Well, there might not be questions. Sometimes when you're hit with a whole lot of information over the head, questions come later. But you guys can have my email, ryan-mackey@cherokee.org. I will type it out in the chat. Oops. I can't spell. Not even my own name. I do that for governmental purposes. Wado guys, I appreciate all of you. My email is in the chat. And of course, you guys can talk to Miss Squirrel or Mr. Bearpaw, anybody at CCO, and they can get you in contact with me too. So if there are no more questions, I just want to say, Wadon, Nagad, thank you all. Next time, we'll see each other again.
What, Ryan?
Wadon.